Hello, this is the second of 3 videos inspired by the film Everything Everywhere All at Once, written and directed by the duo known as Daniels. I recommend that if you haven't seen the film, go watch it before viewing this video. I'll be referring to the film as Everything for short. What I plan to do is to use the absurdist imagery within the film as a launching point for exploring a question. And before I get to that question, let me list just a few of the things that happen to Evelyn, the film's protagonist, as she is making her way through her transcendent yogic journey. She wears baby clothing. She watches her daughter Joy, dressed as Elvis, walking a pig on a leash. She watches Joy take a bong hit from a gun. Joy takes out people via Latin dance, Mexican wrestling, and a confetti blast. Evelyn's fingers turn into hot dogs. She learns a style of kung fu based on the power of the pinky finger. She fights 2 men who get kung fu powers from putting objects in their backsides. I could go on, but I'll stop here. The question I want to explore is the following. Why is this movie so stupid? This same question applies to Daniel's previous film, Swiss Army Man, a touching story in which a man befriends a magical farting corpse. Many viewers report that these films are deeply meaningful to them and caused a strong emotional reaction. While watching Everything, I found myself laugh-crying on several occasions. So, what is it about the stupid movie that causes such a reaction in people? My previous video in the series described how the film Everything serves as an insightful view into the yogic journey that some call Enlightenment. So perhaps that has something to do with it. It's a moving story focused on the relationships within an economically strapped first-generation immigrant family. From a filmmaking point of view, pretty much all aspects of production are executed extremely well, even though there's an argument to be made that the third act could be tighter. But I do think there's more to it than all of these things. There's something else I've been mulling over for some time now. It concerns an aspect of the yogic journey that isn't typically mentioned on the spiritual journey brochure. It seems to me that the cliched, typical understanding of what some people call enlightenment or living in the Tao is not quite right. And I think Daniels made a movie that speaks to this. Many of us get the impression that once someone becomes a so-called enlightened person, they turn into some sort of tranquil, quiet monk. Someone living a simple, straightforward life. A modern example is the media-cultivated image of someone like Eckhart Tolle. There are likely many reasons for the popularity of this tranquil sage image, one of which I think is the fact that most people live constantly attempting to escape the confusion and the discomfort found in the status quo. Chogyam Trungpa cautioned spiritual seekers that it is easy to replace worldly materialism with spiritual materialism. He noticed people want tranquil, never-ending peace. They want a way to avoid the sufferings that come with our status quo way of living, and people become obsessed with the idea of some future state of peace and bliss and complete happiness, where all knowledge is somehow known and understood. Now, one could argue he used this line of argumentation to justify controversial, problematic, or even criminal behavior, but I've come to think he was at least right on the overall point. This so-called state of enlightenment, living in the Tao, isn't what we think it is. It seems to me that one doesn't necessarily become some ascended master with zero displays of emotion. One doesn't necessarily become an all-knowing being full of rational knowledge about the world. I'm coming around to the idea that what people call enlightenment is fundamentally absurd, irrational, and super ridiculous. That's a feature, not a bug. Let's consider Zen Buddhism. Many on the yogic path look at Zen masters as prime examples of what enlightenment should be like. This image is the kind of Zen image that many think is the goal of a spiritual journey, a calm, peaceful life. But what is at the essence of Zen? I think a good entry into the relationship between absurdity and the so-called enlightened state is the dialogue between a student and teacher called Mondo in some Zen traditions. Many of these exchanges were outright absurd. Writer and lecturer Alan Watts talks about such exchanges. Here are 2 interesting ones. A master Zen teacher is sitting in front of a group of students. One student asks, "What is the secret teaching of Buddhism?" The master took him into the garden and silently pointed at 2 bamboo sticks. He said, "What a tall one that is. What a short one that is." And the student was then enlightened. A second story goes like this. There was a master who was walking with some students in the woods. He picked up a tree branch and questioned the student, "What is this?" The student looked at him blankly. The master then quickly hit him with the branch. A second student asked if he could hold the branch. The teacher handed the branch to the second student. The second student quickly hit the master with it. The master accepted this as a response to his question. So what's this all about? Watts explains that the nature of these exchanges is the same nature as jokes. The point is to elicit a non-rational reaction in the listener. In the case of a joke, the idea is to elicit the reaction of spontaneous laughter, a ha-ha exclamation. In the case of Mondo exchanges, the idea is to elicit the reaction of spontaneous understanding, also called awakening, which results in a aha. Absurdity breaks open one's rational, logical mind. It exposes an alternative way of cognition, a deeper understanding. Absurdity is a method of unblocking the blockages created by the logical, intellectual mind. Ridiculousness allows for the irrational, spontaneous mind to arise from underneath the dominance of our socially conditioned personality structure. Looking at it through the frame of Eight Ciruit Yoga, which is a series published on this channel, it could be said that absurdity plays an important role in allowing one to step out of third circuit rational intellectualized maps of the world into higher circuit activity. We all use mental maps to understand our reality. They're pretty much necessary for navigating the status quo. But existence itself is much more than our rational minds can comprehend. In the film Everything, there is a very effective and humorous narrative device where characters have to do something deeply irrational to tap into intelligence and skills from other dimensions. This is both incredibly funny and an insightful, vivid representation of the importance of breaking through the confines of rational thinking. Evelyn sticking her fingers into her father's nose and taking his boogers and shoving them into his mouth is, to me, a profound Zen teaching. A few months ago, I received some emails from a very kind stranger. This person mentioned someone named Alfred Jarry. I did some Googling about Jarry, but I found nothing of major interest. Later, 2 emails into an exchange, this person wrote to me about Jarry again. The wording was very close to what they wrote in the first email. And the second Jarry email seemed like a non sequitur. It didn't make much sense within the flow of the conversation. So whether this was intentional or not, it felt to me like some sort of Zen Mondo exchange. So I looked up Jarry again. This second look sent me down a rabbit hole that lasted for weeks. Here are some things that I learned. Alfred Jarry was a French multimedia artist, philosopher, and symbolist. He had a larger-than-life personality, and over the course of several works, he created Pataphysics. Pataphysics was to be the science of imaginary solutions. Jarry wrote that pataphysics is to metaphysics what metaphysics is to physics. There's a lot to the bizarre subject of pataphysics which has been expanded upon by many people since Jarry's death. But I'll keep my focus to a few key aspects that I think relate to the ideas I'm exploring in this video. In pataphysics, one uses Pataphors. Pataphors are a sort of hyper-extension of metaphors. The way I understand it is that a pataphor sort of gives further life, an additional dimension to metaphor. A pataphor is a step beyond a simple metaphor. A pataphor has its own embodied reality. According to the website Wikiwand, a metaphor is the comparison of a real object or event with a seemingly unrelated subject, in order to emphasize these similarities between the two. A pataphor uses the newly created metaphorical similarity as a reality on which to base itself. Okay, so this gets hard to get one's head around, so let me give an example. In Everything, there's a scene where Evelyn explains to her husband and daughter that their bodies are being controlled by other beings. She uses the metaphor of Ratatouille, the Disney Pixar film where a rat controls the movements of a cook's body by pulling his hair. Evelyn mistakenly calls that movie Raccacoonie, thinking that Ratatouille featured a raccoon. The directing duo Daniels then take that metaphor and make it into a Pataphor, embodying Raccacoonie in its own world. Later in the film, Evelyn unexpectedly ends up interacting with the characters within the world of Raccacoonie. It's absurd and ridiculous. Jarry and his followers took pataphysics seriously in some respects. There is, for example, a college of Pataphysics, but it's also an absurdist joke at the same time. The College of Pataphysics states they're a, quote, society committed to learned and useless research. Writer René Daumal said, Pataphysics is a huge and elaborately constructed hoax, just as Zen is an exercise in hoaxing. And Jarry seemingly made it his mission to hoax and shock his audience. The first performance of his influential play, Ubu Roy, begins with a character yelling the word murdre, which is a nonsense word. It's an intentional misspelling of the French word for shit. This apparently caused a riot in the crowd that night, and his play was quickly cancelled. While Ubu Roy was considered childish and stupid, that night was also considered to be very influential, a precursor to Dada, Surrealism, and theater of the absurd. It is unclear to me whether Daniels are aware of pataphysics, but there was one scene in particular which was so on the pataphysical nose that it makes me wonder. There is a scene that plays out in mostly still images and silence. Evelyn and her daughter Joy, now multi-dimensional goddesses, have decided to live as two rocks in a barren wasteland. Since they cannot speak, the audience can read their dialogue exchange via text on the screen. At one point they laugh at the absurdity that is existence. They call it a big effing joke. And the film practically freezes on a trail of ha-has on the screen. The ha-ha plays an important function in pataphysics. It is discussed in Andrew Hugel's book Pataphysics, A Useless Guide. It's my understanding that the pataphysical ha-ha comes from the humor that arises when we see notions of a transcendent reality being deflated by the mundane realities of life. Yet, even though the concept of the transcendent has been deflated, somehow there's still an opportunity for personal transcendence available to us. In fact, the next moment in the film is a key turning point in Evelyn's journey of personal transcendence. I'll cover that specifically in the next video. It seems to me that the Zen-like, unexpected, humorous absurdity opens the door to a different way of experiencing life. This is a pataphysical way of living, where conceptual metaphors become fleshed out and embodied by characters, by people around you, and these metaphors are then extended out into pataphysical narratives. Some narratives are small, and some narratives are large. Some seemingly logical, some total nonsense, but all valid in some way. Evelyn is not too far off from this realization. She says in a moment of confusion, I can think of any nonsense I want, and somewhere out there, it exists, it's real. This line is delivered in two halves, half in English and half in Mandarin. In fact, throughout the entire film, characters are speaking a mix of English, Cantonese, and Mandarin, which means that to many audience members, there are times when the sound that they're hearing during key dialogue moments is actually nonsense to them. Dr. Raymond Moody, known for his theories on the afterlife, wrote a book on nonsense. He discusses several categories of nonsense and argues that nonsense plays an important role in human life and human language. Nonsense, in his view, is all-pervasive and should not be denigrated when compared to logic and reason. Author Peter Kingsley argues that what we often call Western logic, this kind of rational, analytical thinking, the supposed opposite of the irrational and absurd, actually had its origin from the nonsensical, irrational experiences of people we now call the early Greek philosophers, like Parmenides. And I get pataphysical ha-ha vibes from all of that. We consider ourselves to be these logical, rational individuals, but that's far from the whole story. So here's a narrative. We were born into a state of absurdity and nonsense, and we live in that state as children. Sometimes I look at very small babies and I just think, this child has no idea what's going on. And we live in that state, until we become imprinted to function in the status quo. That's the first 4 circuits of the 8 circuit model. Over time, each of us develops a container that we call our personality, our ego, our social, psychological identity. This container helps us navigate the status quo. It helps us create rational narratives for survival. But the nonsense, the irrational, doesn't just disappear. It becomes what some call the unconscious mind. Our personality structure is like a bonsai tree, which I discuss in this video here, but it could also be compared to a little pot full of mind water. This mind water represents rational, logical mind contents, but the rest of the mind is a vast unconscious sea. And this little rational clay pot floats on the sea of unconsciousness unknowingly. This sea contains an abundance of imaginative powers. It's a source of dreams and fantasy. As we grow up, we learn to disregard the unconscious, but it continues to influence us. It continues to reach out via what I call Circuit 6 communication. And sooner or later, that clay pot starts to leak. The mind contents within it begin to spill, and the seawater gets in. The water all merges together. While the leaky clay pot does its best to float along, boundaries between what is one's external outside life and internal inside life start dissolving. And this is when things get really pataphysical. While pataphysical Zen-like absurdity can be viewed as a tool for unblocking one's mind, I think there's more to it than that. I think pataphysical absurdity can also serve as an indication that the world of one's rational, conscious, logical awareness has begun to integrate with the vast unconscious mind that lies beneath our everyday lives. This unconscious mind can be represented by the higher circuits of the 8 circuit model. If this integration is done in a healthy fashion, life becomes much more fluid and a humorously strange affair. A so-called enlightened individual experiences life as an interconnected web of events that occur both in the inner psyche, the mind, and also the outer physical world at the same time. These correspondences are sometimes noticed by the rational mind as strange little individual events. C.G. Jung and physicist Wolfgang Pauli use the term synchronicity to describe such events, but something is often lost in studying Jung's work. It's my understanding that Jung and close collaborators like Marie-Louise von Franz thought that all of existence functioned as one big synchronicity. Most of us only notice individual events. The so-called fully enlightened person sees that the entirety of existence is chock full of correspondences of meaning. They see that human existence is comprised of layers upon layers of metaphors which are embedded in the world around us. In other words, Pataphors. Enlightened awakening could be understood as a perceptual move from two-dimensional linguistic metaphors, Evelyn telling her family about Rakakuni, into three-dimensional, fully fleshed-out Pataphors, Evelyn actually living in Rakakuni's world. In Pataphysics, Jarry used the term syzygy, the many correspondences or alignments which present themselves to us in life. Oftentimes, a syzygy brings about both a ha-ha moment and an aha moment. If one experiences all of life like this, existence becomes basically a big pun that has come to life. One sees that life is so inherently nonsensical that all we can do is try to make some sense out of it. Artist Adrian Pocobelli wrote a great essay called Towards a Real Pataphysics. He writes, Jarry may have been half joking with pataphysics, yet the concept resonates. The nervous system processes and understands reality through narrative. Therefore, we should consider narrative as our primary tool for modeling reality. Narrative, stories. These are essential to how the human nervous system navigates life. Enlightenment, in my view, is a state where a conscious observer is aware that first-person, subjective human experience can only essentially be understood through narratives. The skeptics who tell you the story that only the material, scientific, rational world exists are themselves embedded in their own lives, their own stories. Their so-called super-rational and objective findings are narratives. Now, these narratives can help us maintain our clay pot. They can prevent it from leaking too much and sinking too far down in the unconscious ocean. They could correspond with our observance of the world in many ways, and that's great, but that's not all that there is to life. And it's my view that we all have leaky clay pots, whether we notice it or not. I've come to think that life is so layered in correspondences of meaning. Call it what you want. Jung's synchronicity, Jarry's syzygy, it doesn't matter. Life is so layered in correspondences of meaning that it becomes utterly meaningless. In other words, the so-called enlightened person sees that the narratives in life are so abundant, so integrated, that it becomes this tangled mess. And it's circular. We come into life starting from nonsense. We move to sense. And if we awaken, we can see that there is so much sense that could be made of life that it becomes nonsense. And here's where the work of author James Joyce comes into all of this. Joyce is considered by many to be the greatest writer since Shakespeare. Others consider him a schizophrenic who wrote meaningless drivel at the end of his career. Joyce's final novel, the culmination of his life's work, was Finnegan's Wake. This book is quite incomprehensible. It's not written in straightforward English. Finnegan's Wake can be described as a book full of nonsense words, which are often combinations of multiple words or misspellings that have various meanings at once. Check this one out. After Joyce's death, the work of folks like Joseph Campbell, Henry Morton Robinson, Robert Anton Wilson, and many others have helped unlock the novel's secrets. Finnegan's Wake isn't a work meant to be read like a normal narrative. It's meant to be a visceral first-person experience for the reader. Each section of the novel involves wild shifts of scene and characters without the reader being oriented. One narrative is mixed with another. Personalities are combined and separated in a span of a few words. Centuries, locations, and characters change within a sentence. It's like a soup broth cooking in a huge pot, constantly swirling, changing its composition as it cooks. Joyce was methodically attempting to artistically represent the absurdity and irrationality of the dream state, of the unconscious mind. Finnegan's Wake is a fictionalized documentation of the dream state. Joyce is consciously using night logic, dream logic. He did this to an extent in his previous book Ulysses, but there it was more contained. Joyce apparently wasn't huge on explaining himself, but he did say, quote, "One great part of every human existence is past in a state which cannot be rendered by the use of wide-awake language, cut-and-dry grammar, and go-ahead plots." Both Joyce and Daniels present stories to us using what Sigmund Freud called the dream work. Freud argued that dreams follow their own kind of cognition processes. Dream work involves the unconscious mind ciphering and transforming ideas and insights into symbolic representations. Our conscious mind must then work to decipher these symbolic representations. Freud also said that this dream work mechanism can be observed in art, music, literature, jokes, and slips of the tongue. It's pretty clear to me that Joyce and Daniels are experts at representing dream work in their respective artistic mediums. Now, while all of this sounds academic and serious and maybe boring, it's all equally ridiculous. In fact, Joyce's most challenging novels, Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses, are comedies. Everything Everywhere All at Once and Swiss Army Man are comedies as well. So while these works indeed deal with some serious subject matter, they all embody what Robert Anton Wilson called hilaritas. Hilaritas is a state of good-natured humor that seems to be characteristic of the higher states of consciousness, the higher circuits in the 8-circuit model. This hilaritas has its roots in the pataphysical ha-ha. We laugh at the juxtaposition of mundane, crass, biophysical processes and supposedly serious subject matter like transcendence and religion and love. Joyce and Daniel seem to put in great effort into tying the most off-putting aspects of life together with the larger cosmic web of transcendent being. The large mythological and metaphysical narratives of mankind, those narratives found in myth, history, fantasy, religion, spirituality, and popular culture, are shown as intimately connected with the most routine, mundane, and disgusting aspects of human life. In my first video, I mentioned that while I loved everything and highly recommend it, I did see people walk out of several showings. I know people who didn't really enjoy it very much. So this sort of material isn't for everyone. Joyce's work includes urination, defecation, adultery, prostitution, public masturbation, voyeurism, cuckoldry, suicide, and death. Daniel's work involves BDSM, anal sex toys, flatulence, magical erections, and physical intimacy with a corpse. The main narrative arc presented by all of these works are actually pretty straightforward. When you look at the linear plot, not much happens, but it's all remarkably multi-layered and cosmically important. In Joyce's Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, a routine day or night in Dublin somehow intrinsically connects with the entire cosmos, past, present, and future. In Everything, the events of one day, a visit to the IRS, and an evening New Year celebration are intimately connected with the fate of the entire cosmos, past, present, and future. Some narratives shown within the film are presented as a film within the film that we're watching. Then Daniels takes the additional step to break into our realities as viewers by incorporating footage of Michelle Yeoh's real-life Hollywood red carpet appearances. There's another entry point into understanding the dreamwork approach found in Joyce's writings and Daniels' films. Their pataphysical, interconnected, multi-layered, absurdist presentation is remarkably similar to the kinds of hallucinatory experiences caused by the psychedelic psilocybin. This particular psychedelic and other similar compounds allow one to enter an altered state that features bizarre imagery, multiple layers of association within that imagery, and a general sense of hilaritas. And often it involves a powerful sense of love, unity, and appreciation for life. These characteristics are certainly to be found in Joyce and Daniels' work. Dr. Timothy Leary, creator of the 8 Circuit model, an advocate for the use of psychedelics, said Joyce's prose prepared me to enter psychedelic space. I'd argue that the film Everything can now play a similar role for someone who wants to better understand the psychedelic experience. There are many parallels to key aspects of the psychedelic experience, from the carnival of absurdity to having simple thoughts expand into temporary pataphysical realities, to getting overwhelmed by the whole experience, to vomiting, and of course, powerful transcendent epiphanies. Leary and esteemed psychonaut Terence McKenna were both interested in how media technology can create virtual realities. They seem to think that multimedia rave experiences could recreate aspects of the psychedelic state. I've always been personally skeptical of that point of view, but it seems to me that Daniels have come close to accomplishing this feat for some people. In the final shot of Everything, Evelyn is back to her routine life, but she still hears voices. I'd call this a Circuit 6 experience. Her clay pot will always be leaking. My feeling is that these intrusions of her unconscious mind into her conscious life will never fully go away now. But she has a grasp on how and when to engage with them, and when not to. This to me is the essential difference between the state called Enlightenment and mental illnesses like schizophrenia. And one could argue that both films by Daniels are about people experiencing a psychotic break. But in Evelyn's case, it seems that she can snap back into conscious, awake awareness when she chooses to. Her fantastical dream work adventures have taught her what she needed to learn, and for the most part, she made it back in one piece. Robert Anton Wilson said that the most impactful writing and acting, quote, proceeds from a kind of alteration in consciousness, a kind of controlled schizophrenia. Despite some differences, these two works share key themes. First is that love is an all-powerful unifying force throughout the cosmos. Secondly, a human being's subjective experience of life is presented as incredibly meaningful and significant, and simultaneously totally meaningless and insignificant. This emptiness and meaninglessness is a vital aspect of certain traditions within some forms of Buddhism and Hinduism. This meaninglessness isn't nihilism or a morally bad thing. One's recognition of transcendent emptiness actually allows for a state of total appreciation. And in this state of total appreciation, one can sort of soak up all the meanings that can be found within life, even within the smallest events of one's day-to-day activity. At the end of the film, Evelyn hugs her daughter Joy, who just came back from the brink of nihilism. Evelyn tells Joy, "We can do whatever we want. Nothing matters." And they share a laugh together. They laugh because it's all so pataphysically preposterous and, as said in the film, awkward. The cosmos is so incredibly interconnected that everything matters and nothing matters simultaneously. And there is freedom in this. The aha moment, when this is comprehended, is what some Buddhists call satori. Wilson often recounted something that a Zen teacher once said: "There is nothing special about enlightenment. You do it every night in your sleep. Zen is just a trick for doing it when you're awake." I want to close out this video with some insight from a discussion between Dr. Alan Roberts and his insightful audience members during a lecture on Finnegan's Wake. I'll link to it. Roberts says that the very concept of meaning actually breaks down when we realize that what we call meaning is simply the awareness that situations and things are related to each other. When we look closely, there's nothing there. So all we can truly say is that in life there's a process which echoes itself. All of life interlinks with itself, and we can feel those deep connections deep inside of us when we're able to notice. And in a day you can live a whole life. In the morning you are born, in the evening you die, and in every event throughout that day, there are infinite narrative cycles that play out within larger narrative cycles, which in turn play out within even larger narrative cycles, and this goes on and on. It's all linked together. All of life's narratives are somehow folded inside themselves to the utter point of meaninglessness, and everything is happening together. Or in other words, life is everything, everywhere, all at once. Adam says it's all meaningful and it's all meaningless, so get on with it and enjoy. It's pure play. To me, the deepest truths simply don't make sense. And this realization is the absurdity of enlightenment. That line was meant to be the end of the video, but I noticed something. The day I wrote the first draft of this video outline was June 16th, 2022. This was the day that I first decided to include the work of James Joyce. A few days later, I realized that June 16th was Bloomsday. Bloomsday is Dublin's annual celebration of the life and work of James Joyce. Haha.